let's go ahead. We're going to be taking a look at permissions, or how do we implement access control. Right? This whole idea here is allowing users to be able to do what we want them to do, but nothing more, nothing less. In this section, we're going to be covering 4 big concepts. What are resources? What are actions? What are permissions? And what are roles? So let's start off with the first, resources. In Liferay, there are 2 different types of resources. The resource itself is a way of representing either the portlet or the model entity. So with that, we have 2 types of resources: portlet resource and model resource. So the portlet resource is kind of the portlet box or the portlet window, right? It's the gray border that we've seen around a number of our different applications. The model resource is typically the stuff that's inside the box. Now, technically speaking, or more technical, it's the entity that's from the database being displayed through our portlet. So portlet resources, again, are the portlet box itself. The way that we define or find these portlet resources is based off of its portlet ID or its portlet name. So we would typically look within the component annotation to find the name of the specific portlet. So portlet component, look within that property, you'll see that JavaX portlet name. So one example here is when we're creating, or with the blogs portlet, in the component annotation, you'll see the JavaX portlet name, blogs portlet keys.blogs. Oftentimes in Liferay, we have abstracted out the name of the portlet into its own class. And so the class blogs portlet keys has the name of the portlet, com Liferay blogs web portlet blogs portlet. So it does take a little bit of some navigation, a little bit of Liferay experience to really get comfortable with the naming convention and how to find it. In one of our exercises, I'll kind of go through and show you guys how I do it. So portlet resource, usually defined by the name of the portlet. Model resource is the entity that's going to be displayed within the portlet resource. Usually when we're describing our model resources or referencing them, we're using their fully qualified name. So the whole package and the class that represents that specific entity. So for web contents, com Liferay journal model journal article. For blog entries, com Liferay blogs model blogs object, or blogs entry. And we can map the same thing with our entity objects as well for the assignment and the submission. Now, actions. So we've hit resources, we have portlet and model. Now we have actions. And actions come in 2 different flavors as well. Let's start off with some examples first. So with the actions, we can do things to portlets or applications like add the portlet to the page, or see the portlet application, or configure it. We can also perform actions on the entities themselves, like delete the entity from the database, update the entity, add the entity, and so on. Right? And each one of these specific actions can be customized. So what we have here in our list are just strings. When we dive into the code, we'll elaborate a little more. When we're dealing with actions, 2 different types. Our first one is known as top level action. This is an action that is not applied directly on a specific resource. Now this sounds a little bit funny, but the best example that we have is when we create something brand new. So let's say, for example, I am creating an assignment. Now when I create the assignment, this is our greatest example of a top level action. So when we create the assignment is not actually there yet, right? There is no physical assignment that I'm dealing with, right? So when I am creating I'm not using the action create on anything specific yet, since it's not there. Another example could be like subscribing. Let's say we subscribe to a feed of blog posts. I'm not subscribing to any specific blog post, but rather the feed whenever a new one comes up. So not anything specific. This is not directly applied to something specific. Next type of action is a resource action, right? This is the classical action that we have. This is the action that is directly applied to something. So when we delete a specific assignment, we know exactly which assignment we're deleting. Or when we update a specific assignment, that action is directly applied to that assignment, right? If I'm talking to someone like Joe or Troy or Jill, right, this would be the example of a resource action. So maybe your name is one of those, maybe not. Permissions. So we have resources, we have actions, and permissions are just kind of the combination of the two. An action that's performed on a resource. That's pretty much it. So creating an assignment, that's a permission. Deleting a submission, that is a permission. So combination of what action can I perform on a specific resource. Right, so very simple. When we're dealing with permissions, they can be scoped in a number of different ways. So this permissioning system can be at the portal instance level, the site level, as well as a per person level. Right? You can take a look more in our source code to kind of explore some of those aspects. Roles. So resource, actions, permissions, and then we have roles. Roles are a collection of permissions. So rather than saying you are able to create an assignment, you are able to delete an assignment, you are able to update an assignment, and you go to each individual person and say that, what we can do instead is create a role. Within the role, it has a list of all of the different permissions that we can perform. You then take the role and then assign it to the user, and then they gain or inherit all of the permissions defined within the role. Now, a role can be assigned to a number of different things. A role can be assigned to an individual user, and this is going to sound a little funny. You can also assign a role to a site, an organization, as well as a user group. The idea here is if I'm a member of a site and the site has a role, then I as the user get the role, so long as I'm a part of the site. And the same idea with the organization. If the organization has a role and I'm assigned to the organization, then I too will also gain that role. Same idea with the user group. I'm a member of the user group and the user group has a role assigned to it, then I too am assigned that specific role. Roles are also scoped. So we have three big scopes when we're dealing with permissions. We have the portal-wide scope, or the platform. We have sites and organizations, and you can kind of have a little bit of an in-between. But those are the three big scopes that that roles have, or the platform, sites, and organizations. Generally, or I should say always, we are always giving roles to users so they have permissions to do what they want. In Liferay, we never give an individual user a specific permission. So we don't say, you can do this, you can do that. We say, we're going to give you this role so that you can do the things that are defined within it. So let's take a look at this diagram here. So we can have a user who belongs to a user group or a site or an organization. They can belong to any one of these three things, and each one of those things can be assigned a specific role. So let's take an easy one. A user belongs to a user group, and the user group is assigned to a specific role. Within that role, it defines a permission. So it says you can perform a specific action upon a specific resource. That resource can either be it can be an application, it could be the model entity in the database, or it can be something else, right? These permissions are defined within a file called default.xml. So what is an action and what is a resource? We'll define the specifics within a file called default.xml. Right, so this is the flow of the permissions. So a user can belong to one of these things, or none of them at all. The user can be directly assigned a role or be a part of something and inherit a role from that something. Role defines a permission, saying that you can perform a specific action on a resource, and depending on what type of resource we are defining, either an application or the model entity itself. So the way that we manage permissions within Liferay is going to be through the UI. In the control panel, under the user section, there's a section called roles. And within that roles section is where we can kind of pick and choose our different resources and what actions can you perform on them. So defining our permissions. So how do we implement permissioning within our own custom application? We start off by creating a file that will declare where our, we'll call it the permissioning file is. So we're going to create a file called portlet.properties. Within portlet.properties, we're going to say we're going to define permissions in another file called default.xml, and this is where it is. So define where our permissioning file is going to be. Next thing is within that permissioning file called default.xml is where we define what are our permissions, what are our resources. So what actions can we perform on a resource? We then will go through and add any sort of management of those resources, the abstract generic object. So we need to create what I call a permission resource. This is done within the service implementation. From there, we'll then do permission checking to ensure that users are able to do what they're trying to do, but users who do not have the proper permissions cannot do that specific action. All right, so let's review those once again. So step one is the declaration file. Within the file portlet.properties, we basically say, hey Liferay, I'm going to be defining permissions in another file. This is where it's going to be. So that's step number one. So continuing on with that, in portlet.properties, this is basically the line that we're going to be added, this resource actions config, and then we're going to say, this is where it is. So pointing to where our default.xml is. The second step is to actually create that default.xml file. Now, technically speaking, you can call this whatever you want, but in this example here and in Liferay, we always call it default.xml. We typically place it in this directory called resource actions, but again, you have control over where you may want to go. What we typically do is we will create multiple default.xmls. We'll create one for our model resources, and we'll create another for our portlet resources. So when we're creating for the model resource, this is going to be within our gradebook service module. When we're creating for the portlet resource, this is going to be over in our gradebook web module. So this is what default.xml looks like. We're basically saying, for this example, this is my portlet resource. These are the actions that you can perform on the portlet resource. We define a couple of defaults as well as some things that the guest role in this example cannot do. So what's interesting is with the action keys, you can actually put whatever you want. Instead of delete, if you want to say recycle, you can do that. Instead of view, if you want to say look, you can do that too. These action keys are just strings. When we do our permission checking, all that happens is we're looking for that specific string, whatever we define. And we'll again see more of that within our examples. So previous was the portlet resource. Over here is the model resource. So we'll see close to the top the model name, com Liferay blogs. Now for me, this is an indicator that this is going to be a top level action. The way I know that is because the model name is not something specific. If you look a little bit further down, you'll see in the model name, com Liferay blogs model, blogs entry. Blogs entry is a specific model resource. So I know everything defined below that is going to be a resource action. Whereas up at the top, this is going to be a top level action. Now with our model resources, we are usually going to display them within a specific portlet. And so we get to define that. Where is the model resource going to be referenced? Which portlet? And then, just as we've seen before, we define the specific actions that we can perform on the resource. So Liferay does have a couple of defaults that it stores within its own class, but otherwise, again, we have our choice. We have free reign to call this whatever we want. So we define our permissions within the default.xml. Next thing we do is what we call manage resources. And so I like to use the term permission resource. Technically in code, it'll say model resource. So we have a permission resource that's used to keep track of the permissioning of a specific entity or portlet. So each individual assignment will have its own permission resource, keeping track of what roles can do what with this specific resource. So each one will have its own. And so what we want to do is we want to create a permission resource for every entity that is created. So we want every single assignment to have its own permission resource. Right? And so we're going to add the logic to do just that. So this is what it's going to look like. Right? So you'll see the call to the resource local service to add a resource, and we're going to be passing a bunch of parameters. You'll also see the same thing in the second method call, right, to add the model resource as well. Okay. In the same train of thought, whenever an assignment or blog entry in this example is deleted, we also want the permission resource to be deleted as well. So that way we don't have these floating resources within our database. Right? So whenever we add or create a blog entry, we create that resource with it. Whenever we delete it, we'll also delete the resource that goes with it. And then step number 4, this is where we do permission checking. We will do a check using Liferay's permission checker to see, does a specific user have the proper roles and permissions to perform whatever sort of action they are trying to perform. And so this right here is an example of permission checking in this case. So we're going to be using this method contains to make sure that they have a specific action ID. So the idea here is a user given a role has a permission. When they have that permission, they will have the action ID that corresponds with it. So remember how I said over in default.xml, we can define whatever action keys we want. When we do permission checking, that action ID parameter is the action key that we're looking for. So if you want to check for the ability to recycle, that would be the parameter that you add within the action key or the action ID. So in this example here, we're looking at the permission checking for the specific portlet in this case. So this is permission checking for the portlet resource. Over here, it's a very similar idea, but in this situation, we're checking for the model resource. So idea is the same. In this case, though, we're going to be doing it for the model resource. And then finally, right, we want to make sure that permission checking is going to happen in all of our layers. This is a good example or a good time to have redundancy, right? And so, right, we're going to do permission checking for each one of our different layers. So service layer, right, not persistence, but controller layer and the service layer. So over in our implementation class, as we add a block entry in this example, right, we are also going to do our permission check. We're going to be checking specifically for that action key, add entry, right? And assuming all goes well, we'll then make a call to the original one to ensure that we indeed are able to, or once we do the permission check, we'll then make a call to actually add our entry. Okay. We can also add permission checking at the UI or the JSP level, right? Using this cif, we can put the permission checking logic within our JSP or maybe somewhere else, and then do the check here in the JSP to ensure that the user can actually see the add button, for example. So we can permission check different UI elements within our JSPs. Now let's take a look behind the scenes, under the hood, to take a look at what's going on behind the database or in the database. So within the resource action table, we can see the blogs entry here, and we can see the different actions that can be performed on our specific entities, whether for portlets. So portlet models or resource or entity resources. Right, and so this is kind of what it looks like here behind the scenes, right? Each different column, right, for our specific Liferay instance, right? Each individual blog portlet on the page, right, is going to be an entry. Each individual blog entry will also have its own place, since each individual entity or portlet will have a permission resource that goes with it. So, very long conversation here. Let's go ahead and put this into practice by adding our gradebook application into Liferay's permissioning system. Right, so we'll do, just as mentioned, we're going to add the gradebook application so that it supports permissioning. So the steps that we went over before, we're going to cover those here again. So we're going to create a file called portlet.properties over in the gradebook web. This is just pointing and defining where our default.xml is going to be. We'll then create the default.xml and define what is our portlet resource, what actions can we perform on it. From there, we're going to be doing the same thing with our gradebook service, but this time defining what is our model entity and what are the actions that we can perform on it. We'll make sure to create that resource every time an assignment or submission is either created or deleted, and then we're going to be implementing permission checking, and then we'll go through the different layers of Liferay to implement permission checking. So let's go ahead, dive into Liferay Developer Studio, and go ahead and implement permission checking or permissions.